On a bright June morning, St. Mildred's vicarage garden looked as though it had been painted fresh for the occasion. The lawn stretched out like a green satin cloth, dotted with white iron chairs, trestle tables decked in embroidered cloths, and the hum of cheerful conversation that floated beneath garlands of paper roses. The annual Summer Aid Garden Party was one of St. Mary Mead's more respectable traditions, one of those agreeable village gatherings where everyone turned out in their Sunday best to pretend life was exactly as pleasant as it looked. Miss Jane Marple, seated comfortably under the shade of a pear tree, was knitting what she informed anyone who asked was a pair of mittens for her niece's youngest. In truth, the pattern had gone slightly awry several rows back. But she found that knitting, correct or otherwise, gave people the reassuring impression that she was occupied with something trivial. It was remarkable, she often thought, what people were willing to discuss when they believed they were being ignored. Children darted between tables clutching scones. The vicar's wife bustled about ensuring the lemonade bowl never dipped below halfway. And Mrs. Lillian Price, whose sweet disposition masked an appetite for mischief, fluttered about collecting gossip as neatly as a sparrow gathers crumbs. All in all, it was exactly the sort of peaceful, well-ordered village event where nothing unexpected ever happened, which is why the unexpected struck with such peculiar force. It began with a stranger. Not an unusual occurrence in itself, for the village had begun receiving its fair share of ramblers and day visitors since the train station had upgraded its timetable. But this man was not of the usual sort. He stood near the stone wall at the far end of the garden, half within the shade of an overgrown ivy trellis, observing the party with a stillness that was almost too careful. Tall, thin, and dressed in a dark suit far too heavy for the season, he looked more like a mourner who had wandered into the wrong gathering than a cheerful celebrant of summer charity. His hands, Miss Marple noticed, were clasped behind him in a posture of stiff restraint, and his gaze moved not with idle curiosity, but with deliberate attention, taking note of people, pairing faces with names overheard, marking movements. "Visitor, is he?" Miss Marple murmured, almost to herself. Mrs. Price, who had descended upon her like a genial hurricane, seized the opportunity. "Oh, haven't you heard, Miss Marple? They say he arrived on the early train. No one seems to know who he's come to see." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Most unusual to attend a charitable garden party without so much as an introduction. "Well, I for one think he has a rather sinister air," Mrs. Price confided, delighted by the drama. "Perhaps he's a newspaper man, or a private investigator." She lowered her voice theatrically. "Or perhaps he is simply shy." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Shy men seldom hide in shadows, I've found." The stranger remained for some time, drifting just close enough to overhear fragments of conversation before slipping back into the shade. At one point, he approached the refreshment table and spoke a few words to Miss Edgecombe, the schoolmistress, but whatever he said caused her to pale visibly, nearly dropping a plate of seed cake. Miss Marple watched. She said nothing. The garden party's harmony was shattered half an hour later. It happened just as the village brass quartet launched into a spirited, if somewhat unsteady, rendition of "Rule Britannia." A sharp cry cut through the festive air, a woman's cry edged with fear rather than pain. Guests froze mid-conversation. The vicar stepped off the bandstand, alarmed. Miss Marple placed her knitting neatly on the table and followed the rising tide of concerned murmurs toward the source of the commotion. Near the rose arbor, Mrs. Eliza Hartwell, newly arrived in the village after inheriting her late cousin's cottage, was standing rigid, her gloved hands trembling violently. Beside her lay a small leather-bound notebook, fallen open upon the grass. He startled me," she stammered, pressing a hand to her throat. "That man, he spoke to me, in a whisper, right behind my ear. I didn't even see him approach." "The stranger?" someone asked breathlessly. Mrs. Hartwell nodded, her face ashen. He said something about Thomas. There was a ripple of silence through the crowd. Thomas Hartwell had been dead for nearly 3 years, and Mrs. Eliza Hartwell, young, pretty, and uncomfortably solitary, had carried herself ever since with the fragile dignity of a woman who did not speak of her tragedy. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice soft and steady. "My dear, what exactly did he say?" Mrs. Hartwell swallowed, eyes flickering with the memory of the moment. "He said, 'You cannot hide forever.' Thomas knew the truth." Her voice broke slightly. I turned around, and he was already walking away. The garden swelled with worried whispers. Mrs. Price, sensing fresh scandal, nearly vibrated with anticipation. "What truth?" demanded Colonel Denham, who had never learned the art of subtlety. I don't know," Mrs. Hartwell insisted, her voice trembling. "Thomas never. She pressed a hand over her mouth, fighting for composure. Miss Marple stooped to retrieve the fallen notebook. It was old, its spine cracked from use. Inside, the pages were densely filled with tightly inked handwriting, none of it in Mrs. Hartwell's hand. "Is this yours?" Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Hartwell stared at it as if at an apparition. "No, I've never seen it before." Several villagers gasped. The stranger was nowhere to be seen. Inspector Hargreaves arrived within 20 minutes, a stout man with a sort of brisk efficiency that suggested he believed most mysteries could be solved by raising one's voice and asking direct questions. He gathered statements, scoured the immediate area, and ultimately declared the matter likely a misunderstanding, despite the palpable tension still clinging to the garden like a lingering chill. Miss Marple said nothing to contradict him. She simply observed. She noted how Mrs. Hartwell's hands never quite stopped shaking, how Miss Edgecombe, still pale, had retreated behind the lemonade table with a posture that suggested guilt rather than fear, how Colonel Denham, usually a great enthusiast for excitement, kept glancing sharply toward the lane as though expecting someone or avoiding them. And she noted, too, the notebook, its cover unremarkable, its owner unknown, its sudden appearance quite intentional, she suspected. Later, as the party dispersed and the guests drifted away in uneasy clumps, Miss Marple walked slowly back toward her cottage. She passed the gate and paused only once, just long enough to glance toward the lane. A figure stood there, tall, motionless, watching her, the stranger. He inclined his head in the faintest acknowledgement. Then, with a soft gesture, as though brushing dust from his sleeve, he turned and disappeared down the narrow path leading out of the village. Miss Marple watched him go, her expression mild, but her mind already drawing comparisons. Quiet men who appeared out of nowhere. Tragic widows confronted with secrets, and notebooks that surfaced not by accident, but by design. "Oh dear," she murmured to herself. "I fear this is only the beginning." And indeed it was. By late afternoon, the garden party had thinned to a straggling few, who took an almost perverse pride in remaining after the excitement, as though their presence lent them a spectator's privilege over the day's events. The bunting fluttered tiredly above half-cleared tables, and the vicar's wife moved about with a brittle cheerfulness that fooled no one who knew her well. Miss Marple, having offered calm assistance where it was useful and faded gently to the background when it was not, took her leave with a small leather notebook tucked into her reticule. It had been handed to her quite naturally. "You'll know what to do with it, Miss Marple," Mrs. Hartwell had said in a low, strained voice, just out of Inspector Hargreaves' hearing. "I can't bear to keep it with me, not today." "My dear, if you're quite sure," Miss Marple had replied, with a kindly look that encompassed both reassurance and a promise of discretion. As she walked home along the lane, the vicarage garden receding behind her, she allowed her mind to dwell upon the day's peculiarities. It was not merely that a stranger had appeared and spoken to Mrs. Hartwell in such a disturbing fashion. Strangers sometimes did ask odd questions, especially in villages where every face was accounted for, and a newcomer felt instantly on the defensive. No, it was the combination of events, the whisper, the notebook, and the unmistakable impression that all of it had been arranged with care. At her cottage, she set the kettle on and fetched her spectacles. The sitting room was as neat as always, with the faint scent of lavender from a sachet tucked into the curtains. She drew the notebook from her reticule and laid it on the small table beside her chair. For several minutes, she did not open it at all, but simply sat, hands folded, listening to the kettle's soft growing murmur. People, she reflected, seldom chose their method of mischief without reason. A whisper in the air, a message that invoked a dead husband, an object planted where it must be found. These were not the actions of a man seeking simple information or clumsy revenge. They suggested instead a mind that understood fear and the subtle ways it could be introduced into quiet lives. When the tea was poured and sweetened to her satisfaction, she opened the notebook. The handwriting inside was small and meticulous, each line tightly packed, as though the writer had considered space a luxury not to be squandered. It was not a diary in the usual sense. The entries were undated and terse, more like notes made in preparation for something. There were names, some familiar, some not. She turned a page and saw at once. Hartwell, Thomas, risk, moderate, inclination to confess under strain. Possible. Must test. Miss Marple lifted her brows but did not otherwise react. She read on. There was another name beneath it, this one striking a quieter, deeper note of unease. Eliza. Weakness, guilt over past decision. Vulnerable to moral pressure. Will not withstand sustained reminder. Dear me, Miss Marple murmured. There were other entries. A woman identified only as E.E., apparently too nervous to trust, and a man with the initials C.D. described as obstinate but may be manipulated through pride and indignation. Here and there, references to places, the lane by St. Mildred's, cottage near the common, the old quarry road, appeared like coordinates in some private map. Miss Marple closed the book thoughtfully. There was nothing overtly criminal in the pages she had read, yet everything about them made her think of traps, small, invisible snares laid where particular people would be certain to walk. The next morning, the village reacted as villages invariably do to any disturbance. It rearranged its daily routines to allow for more conversation. At the post office, Miss Hart, who prided herself on a brisk efficiency that no one actually required of her, found herself surrounded by ladies who had, quite coincidentally, all discovered urgent need for stamps and postal orders at the same time. Mrs. Price, resplendent in a hat that seemed designed more to collect information than to shade her from the sun, was in fine form. I distinctly heard him mention truth, she announced to the cluster near the biscuit tins. It was the way he said it, you know, as though truth was something one might mislay in a drawer and hope never to see again. And poor Mrs. Hartwell. Well, if you ask me, there's more there than meets the eye. No one did ask you, Miss Hart observed tartly, weighing out toffees. Mrs. Price ignored her. Of course, it's not my place to speculate. But one does remember that her husband died so suddenly. Abroad, wasn't it? Some sort of accident. Tragic, naturally. But still, these things, well, they have echoes. A great many things have echoes, Lillian, observed Mrs. Bantry, who had come in under pretext of needing a new packet of pins. But that doesn't mean they're about to fall on one's head. I dare say the man is simply a crank. Cranks don't write notebooks, Mrs. Price said promptly, and then colored as several faces turned toward her with sharpened interest. Well, that is to say, I heard there was a notebook. That's what the vicar's wife said, at least. What sort of notebook? Miss Hart asked, unable to resist. But at that moment, the postmistress's bell jingled, and Miss Marple herself entered, neat and unobtrusive in her pale summer hat. Conversation rearranged itself instantly, like a flock of birds changing direction. Miss Marple greeted everyone with her usual gentle courtesy and advanced to the counter to purchase some stationery. She listened, apparently only half attentive, as Mrs. Price embarked once more on a recitation of the previous day's drama. It was remarkable, Miss Marple reflected, how repetition altered small details, how the stranger's whisper became more sinister in each retelling, how Mrs. Hartwell's fright grew increasingly dramatic. Of course, one does wonder who he is, Mrs. Price finished with a sigh. There must be a reason he came here. There usually is, Miss Marple agreed mildly. Strangers seldom choose villages at random. One place is much like another, unless there is something particular to draw them. Mrs. Bantry eyed her shrewdly. You think he came for someone, Miss Marple? Oh, I shouldn't like to presume, Miss Marple said at once. But it does remind me, quite absurdly no doubt, of a case my young nephew told me about, in which a gentleman travelled quite some distance to speak a few words to a lady he believed had wronged him. It caused a great deal of distress and no little scandal, though in the end it turned out the lady had merely forgotten to post a letter. There was polite laughter, but several eyes flickered with unease. Miss Marple collected her purchases, exchanged a few more pleasant remarks, and took her leave, having gained what she wanted. A sense of how the village was thinking. They were curious, certainly, anxious, perhaps, but not yet frightened. The stranger was a story, not a danger. That, she thought as she walked home. Looking up at the familiar cottage roofs and carefully tended hedges, would not last. In the afternoon, Inspector Hargreaves paid her a visit. He arrived with the air of a man who considered old ladies both harmless and vaguely troublesome. Miss Marple received him in her sitting room with tea and a plate of shortbread that had the mild, disarming effect of lowering his guard without his quite noticing. I understand you've got hold of that notebook, Miss Marple, he said after the usual pleasantries. Yes, indeed. Mrs. Hartwell did not feel equal to it yesterday. I was just about to send word to you. She rose, fetched it from a small drawer, and placed it in his hands. It is an odd sort of thing, is it not? Hargreaves flipped it open, frowned, and turned a few pages. Looks like some fellow's private notes. Names, impressions. Nothing illegal in that. No, nothing at all, Miss Marple agreed. I did think it was curious, though, that it should appear precisely where it would upset Mrs. Hartwell most. Left near her feet, was it not? Could have been dropped by accident, he said. The stranger might have been using it and put it down for a moment. You know how it is. People get flustered in crowds. Some people do, Miss Marple said gently. Others are very careful indeed. He glanced up, slightly irritated. You think this stranger meant to frighten her? I think, Miss Marple replied, that whoever placed that notebook there knew enough about Mrs. Hartwell's mind to be certain it would trouble her. And I do not believe that sort of knowledge comes by accident. Hargreaves grunted, looking down again at the cramped notes. His finger halted on the name Hartwell Thomas. Do you know anything about the husband? Only that he died abroad some years ago, Miss Marple said. A railway accident, I believe. Shockingly sudden. Such things are very difficult for the survivors. Any scandal? None that I have heard, Miss Marple replied truthfully. But then, people are sometimes more skillful at concealing distress than one might suppose, especially when they are young and wish to appear brave. He closed the notebook. We'll make some inquiries, of course, about the husband, about this stranger if we can find a description that's useful. For now, I don't see that we've anything more than a bit of mischief and a frightened woman. No, Miss Marple said, as she poured him another cup of tea. Nothing more at all. But when he had gone, she sat for a long time in her quiet sitting room, her knitting untouched on her lap. She was remembering another woman in another village many years ago who had received a strange message invoking the name of a dead man. That too had begun as mischief. It had not ended so harmlessly. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window where the lane curved out of sight. Somewhere, she felt quite certain, the stranger who spoke in whispers was watching how his first little pebble had disturbed the calm surface of St. Mary Mead. And somewhere, too, lay the reason why Thomas Hartwell's name had been dragged back from the grave. Inspector Hargreaves had left with the notebook, promising to look into things, though Miss Marple suspected his inquiries would be as perfunctory as politeness allowed. He was not a stupid man, merely one who preferred simple explanations and peaceful paperwork. Unfortunately, the situation unfolding in St. Mary Mead was unlikely to offer him either. The afternoon drifted toward evening, the sunlight softening over the hedgerows as villagers went about their routines with a faintly heightened awareness, as if they expected the stranger to materialize behind any corner. Miss Marple herself decided on a short walk. Not aimless, though it might have appeared so to anyone observing her. She simply believed, as she often had cause to, that people's thoughts became clearer when their legs were occupied. Her path took her toward the lane where she had last seen the stranger. The dust on the road was lightly disturbed, but that meant little. Several children had ridden their bicycles here earlier, and Mr. Barter Larch's donkey cart had rumbled past around noon. Still she paused, looking thoughtfully at a faint, elongated mark along the verge. It might have been made by a narrow boot heel dragged slightly sideways. It might equally have been the playful smudge of a dog's paw. Miss Marple neither accepted nor dismissed it. She merely noted it and continued. She was not entirely surprised to encounter Miss Edgecombe coming from the direction of the schoolhouse, her stride brisk but her face unsettled. The schoolmistress rarely showed uncertainty, so it was quite noticeable now. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, offering a smile that was a fraction too quick. "What a pleasant evening for a stroll." "Indeed it is," Miss Marple replied warmly. "I do hope you are feeling more yourself today. Yesterday's excitement seemed to trouble you." Miss Edgecombe hesitated, then shook her head with a small, helpless laugh. "Oh, it was nothing. Truly nothing. One never expects someone to approach so abruptly, and I was already flustered with the children's end-of-term preparations." "I quite understand," Miss Marple said, though her eyes gently contradicted the words. "Still, he must have said something that startled you." "Oh, no, nothing at all unusual. Merely asked the time. I suppose I was overtired." She straightened her posture as though bracing herself. "If you'll excuse me, Miss Marple, I must return home." "Of course, my dear." Miss Marple watched her retreating figure with quiet concentration. Miss Edgecombe's explanation had been smooth enough, but smoothness itself was a warning. It showed signs of rehearsal. As Miss Marple resumed her walk, she reflected upon the woman's reaction. Pale yesterday, evasive today, and the stranger had chosen her specifically as he had Mrs. Hartwell. Why these women? What connected them? If the notebook was to be believed, there were notes on multiple villagers, yet 2 names had already drawn the stranger's direct attention. Miss Marple tucked that away for later. Upon returning to her cottage, she found a small envelope pushed under her door. There was no name on it, no address, merely a single sheet inside, folded once. The handwriting was the same precise, narrow style she had seen in the notebook. "Do not interfere." Miss Marple pursed her lips, which was for her an expression equivalent to most people's gasp of alarm. She read the note twice, then slipped it back into the envelope. It was neither threatening nor emotional. That, in her experience, made it significantly more dangerous. Someone had very much wanted her to receive that message quietly. Someone confident enough to approach her home, yet cautious enough to avoid drawing attention. It was, oddly, almost courteous. The next morning brought a fresh wave of gossip and, more importantly, a new development. Miss Marple was preparing a modest breakfast when a frantic knocking shook her front door. When she opened it, she found Mrs. Hartwell standing on the step, her face drawn with fear. "Miss Marple, oh, Miss Marple, something terrible has happened." "Come in at once, my dear," Miss Marple said, guiding her inside. "Sit down and tell me slowly." Mrs. Hartwell struggled for breath before managing. "Someone broke into my cottage last night." Miss Marple froze for only a fraction of a second. "Broke in? Did you see anyone?" "No, I woke to a crash downstairs. Must have been around 2 o'clock. By the time I gathered the courage to go look, the room was empty, but the door had been forced open and my writing desk was rifled through." "What was taken?" "Nothing, at least nothing valuable. But they searched every drawer as though looking for something specific." Miss Marple folded her hands, thoughtful. "And what do you keep in that desk?" Mrs. Hartwell swallowed. "Letters, old letters, and Thomas's things." There it was again, the name that refused to stay buried. "Did you notice anything else?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Yes." Mrs. Hartwell closed her eyes for a moment. One of the letters had been placed on top of the stack. "It wasn't there before. It was the one Thomas wrote me just before he died." Miss Marple felt a subtle tightening in her chest. People seldom moved objects by accident. Placing a letter on top was deliberate. "Would you permit me to see it?" she asked. Mrs. Hartwell hesitated, then nodded. "I brought it with me. I couldn't stay in the house another moment." She produced the envelope with trembling hands. Miss Marple unfolded the paper, scanning the contents. It was a short, affectionate letter in a man's neat script, describing his work abroad and expressing eagerness to return home. But one line, perhaps innocuous to most eyes, stood out immediately. "I feel increasingly certain that matters will come to a head soon. When they do, my dearest Eliza, trust no one but your own heart." Miss Marple's fingers lingered on the words. It was not overtly alarming, yet it hinted at trouble. Trouble Thomas Hartwell had anticipated before his death. "Mrs. Hartwell," she said gently, "did your husband ever speak of difficulties? Of anyone who might have wished him harm?" "No," she whispered, "never. He was the kindest man, honest to a fault. He wasn't mixed up in anything questionable. Everyone said so." Tears welled in her eyes. "I don't understand why this is happening. Why now?" Miss Marple offered her a handkerchief. "We will understand, my dear. In time." But internally, she added, only if the answers still existed to be found. Because someone, whether the stranger or another hand behind the scenes, was orchestrating a sequence of events designed to unsettle very particular people. The whisper, the notebook, the break-in, the note warning her away. These were not random acts, nor the work of a mere crank. They were steps, tests, probes, and someone, somewhere in the village, had begun to show signs of strain. That afternoon, Miss Marple walked discreetly toward the common. She did not announce her intentions. She seldom did when she wished to learn something useful. The break-in suggested familiarity with the village layout. The placement of the note at her door suggested confidence. And the selection of targets, Mrs. Hartwell and Miss Edgecombe, suggested knowledge of private histories. She paused at the far edge of the common where the ground dipped slightly and the trees cast longer shadows. A small piece of paper fluttered among the grass. Miss Marple stooped, picking it up delicately. It was torn from a notebook. A single line remained legible. "If she suspects too soon, alter the next step." Miss Marple read it 5 times before tucking it away. Someone was planning not merely a disturbance, but a sequence, a chain of events meant to produce a very specific reaction. And failing that, they were prepared to modify their approach. She straightened, looking across the quiet, sunlit village. The stranger had come with a purpose. But someone else, someone local, was aiding him, or using him. And the next step, whatever it was, had already been set into motion. Miss Marple held the torn scrap of paper for a long moment, letting its implications settle. Someone was mapping out each move with almost theatrical precision, adjusting their strategy based on reactions. That suggested patience and intelligence, but it also suggested fear. People who planned so carefully were usually terrified of a single thing going wrong. She folded the scrap neatly into her pocket and resumed her walk toward the village. There was no urgency in her step. There seldom was. But her thoughts moved swiftly. If someone wished her to not interfere, it meant they believed she was capable of doing precisely that. And while intimidation was one method of discouragement, it was seldom successful with women of Miss Marple's age and constitution. She had been threatened before, in quieter ways and louder ones, and had always responded much the same, with polite persistence. As she approached the high street, she saw Colonel Denham emerging from the greengrocer's, his expression unusually tight. He was normally a boisterous man, full of blustering certainty. But today he seemed distracted, preoccupied enough that he nearly collided with Miss Marple before noticing her. "My dear Miss Marple," he exclaimed, adjusting his grip on a bag of potatoes. "Beg your pardon. Damnably clumsy of me." "No harm done, Colonel," she said pleasantly. "You seem rather troubled this morning." His mustache twitched. "Troubled?" No, just the usual household fuss. Can't rely on staff these days. Never know when they'll take leave for family matters." He snorted, though the sound lacked conviction. Miss Marple regarded him mildly. "I expect the recent excitement has unsettled many of us." He stiffened. "Excitement? Oh, the garden party nonsense. Yes, quite. Silly business. Police will have it sorted in no time." "I do hope so," Miss Marple murmured, watching the way his eyes darted toward the lane that led to the vicarage, as though expecting someone to appear, though I imagine the stranger's whisper must have been quite alarming to Mrs. Hartwell. "She's a delicate sort," Denham said hastily. "Never quite recovered from her husband's death, I dare say. The slightest thing sends her into hysterics." Miss Marple nodded, though his eagerness to dismiss the matter struck her as slightly too forceful. Colonel Denham was mentioned in the notebook as someone who might be manipulated through pride. She wondered gently what exactly he was proud of, and what he might be hiding. When he hurried off, more quickly than decorum required, Miss Marple's suspicions deepened. The stranger had targeted Mrs. Hartwell and Miss Edgecombe directly. Meanwhile, Colonel Denham behaved like a man expecting a blow that had not yet fallen. Returning home, Miss Marple found herself thinking again of Thomas Hartwell's letter. Matters will come to a head soon. What matters? And why had he felt the need to warn his wife? Could it be connected to what was happening now, years later? The kettle had just begun to boil when another knock sounded at her door, more hesitant than Mrs. Hartwell's, almost apologetic. When she opened it, she found Mr. Rendell, the village solicitor, standing with his hat in hand. "Miss Marple," he said, clearing his throat. "Might I trouble you for a moment?" "Of course, Mr. Rendell. Do come in." He stepped inside, nervously smoothing his coat. "I fear this may be awkward. I've just come from Mrs. Hartwell. She is deeply distressed. She claims she was visited by someone last night." Miss Marple inclined her head. "She told me about the break-in." "Yes, quite. I had hoped she might be exaggerating, but the damage is real, and she insists, quite firmly, that the intruder meant to frighten her." Rendell hesitated. "She asked me to review some old documents regarding her late husband, letters, papers, anything that might explain all this. I must tell you, Miss Marple, I was not aware she still had such difficulties." Miss Marple regarded him thoughtfully. "You knew Mr. Hartwell, did you not?" "To a degree," Rendell said. "I handled a minor legal matter for him before he left England. He was a steady fellow. Nothing about him suggested complications." "And yet you paused just now before saying so." He flushed slightly. "Well, Every man has private burdens, Miss Marple. I only meant that if he was troubled, it was not in any professional capacity. I see, she said softly. Do you believe these events are connected to something in Mr. Hartwell's past? He opened his mouth, then closed it, troubled. I don't know, but Mrs. Hartwell asked whether anything of Thomas's had ever been misfiled, misplaced, some document that might have been meant for her but never delivered. I checked. Nothing seems amiss. Miss Marple poured tea for them both. You are worried for her? Yes, he said simply. She's alone. And fear, Miss Marple. Fear can unbalance people. I want to help her, but I don't know how. Miss Marple sipped her tea, considering. There is one thing you might do. Not for her directly, but for understanding. Rendell leaned forward. Anything. Tell me, she said softly. Did Thomas Hartwell have any disagreements with Colonel Denham? The solicitor blinked. Denham? Why, well, yes, actually. Nothing formal, but there was a dispute. Something minor, I believe, over property boundaries. Hartwell felt the colonel had attempted to claim land that wasn't his. I remember smoothing things over. And did it end amicably? Rendell hesitated. Amicable enough, though the colonel is not one to forget slights. Miss Marple nodded, filing the information away. Thank you, Mr. Rendell. You've been very helpful. When he departed, Miss Marple sat in quiet reflection. Colonel Denham had seemed anxious today, unusually so. Miss Edgecombe had been evasive. Mrs. Hartwell had been targeted twice, and someone had left that note at her cottage, clearly believing she represented an obstacle. That afternoon, she walked to Mrs. Hartwell's cottage, wanting to examine the scene herself. The broken door frame bore the marks of a deliberate, forced entry, not amateurish, but efficient. Inside, the writing desk was pulled open, papers scattered but not shredded. It was a search, not vandalism. Someone had been looking for something. But what? As Miss Marple stood in the quiet room, her eyes fell upon a small detail, a faint indentation in the wax of a candle on the mantelpiece. She stepped closer. The imprint was narrow, rectangular, with the slightest curve along one edge. A matchbox had rested there recently. Someone had set it down briefly, perhaps while examining something else. And if someone brought matches into a home lit by electricity, it meant they expected to need flame, not for light, but for destruction. Someone had intended to burn something, but had not found it. Miss Marple's fingers tightened around her cane. Whatever document the intruder sought had not been discovered. That meant it still existed somewhere. She left the cottage with a growing certainty. The disturbance was escalating, and its architect, whether the stranger or another, was becoming desperate. At dusk, just as the last light bled across the rooftops, a sudden commotion rose near the vicarage. Miss Marple joined the gathering, quickly forming along the lane. Miss Edgecombe stood in the center of it, trembling, pointing toward the churchyard path. I saw him, she cried. The stranger, standing by the gate. He beckoned to me, and then he disappeared behind the yew trees. The villagers murmured anxiously, but Miss Marple, watching Miss Edgecombe's quivering hands, saw something beneath the fear, something sharper. Miss Edgecombe knew more than she had said, and someone had just forced her to show it. Miss Edgecombe stood rigidly in the deepening dusk, her breath coming too fast for someone merely startled. The villagers around her whispered in anxious tones, peering toward the yew-shadowed path as though expecting the stranger to emerge again. But Miss Marple, observing from a small remove, was not deceived by the schoolmistress's trembling. Fear was present, yes, but not the helpless kind she had shown at the garden party. This fear was sharpened, shaped, controlled. It had purpose. Miss Marple stepped forward with gentle calm, her voice soft enough to appear merely soothing. My dear Miss Edgecombe, you mustn't distress yourself. The dusk plays tricks on one's eyes. Sit a moment and breathe. I saw him, Miss Edgecombe insisted, though she sank gratefully onto a nearby stone bench. He stood by the gate, watching me. Then he beckoned, twice, and vanished behind the trees. "Oh, Miss Marple, why is he following me?" "That is what we must understand," Miss Marple replied, lowering herself to sit beside her. "Did he speak? Whisper as before?" "No, not this time. But his gesture, it was as though he wanted me to follow." She pressed a shaking hand to her brow. "I would never have dared." Miss Marple considered her carefully. The woman's eyes were wide but not vacant. Not unfocused, she was alert, too alert for someone on the edge of panic, and her voice held a certain note of rehearsal, as though repeating something decided earlier. "Tell me," Miss Marple said gently. "Have you remembered anything about your conversation with him yesterday? Anything you left unsaid?" Miss Edgecombe's shoulders tensed. "Left unsaid? I told you, he only asked the time." "Of course," Miss Marple murmured. "A very ordinary thing. And yet you were quite shaken." Miss Edgecombe's hands twisted in her lap, and for one fleeting instant she looked as though she might confess something, some memory or truth she had been holding too tightly. But then villagers leaned in with sympathetic noises. The moment broke, and her expression reassembled itself into fragile distress. Inspector Hargreaves arrived shortly thereafter, pushing through the gathering with an expression of increasing irritation at the stranger's persistence. He took Miss Edgecombe's statement, promised additional patrols, and shooed away the crowd with assurances that all would be sorted soon. Miss Marple noted privately that he did not look convinced of this himself. He left muttering about phantoms in churchyards and imaginations gone wild, though he cast a wary glance toward the yews before departing. Miss Marple offered to walk Miss Edgecombe home, and the schoolmistress accepted. Their steps were slow, measured, almost companionable. It was Miss Edgecombe who broke the silence first. "You don't believe me," she said quietly, not accusatory, merely stating a fact. "I believe you saw something," Miss Marple replied. "But I also believe you know more about the stranger than you are telling." Miss Edgecombe stopped walking. Moonlight edged her features with pale uncertainty. For a long moment she said nothing. Then, in a voice almost pleading, "Please, Miss Marple, don't press me. Not yet. I need time." "I understand," Miss Marple said gently. "But do remember, my dear, that secrets have a way of growing heavier the longer one carries them." Miss Edgecombe swallowed hard and resumed walking. When they reached her small, tidy cottage, she paused at the gate. "I truly don't know why he's come," she whispered, "but I fear that someone here does." And with that cryptic remark, she slipped inside, closing the door softly behind her. Miss Marple walked home under the cool wash of starlight, her thoughts assembling themselves piece by quiet piece. Miss Edgecombe was frightened, yes, but more importantly, she was involved, not by choice perhaps, but inescapably. The stranger had approached her with intention, and whatever had bound her to Thomas Hartwell or his affairs, she was unwilling to speak of it. The question, always the key question, was why. The answer came, in part, the following afternoon. Miss Marple had been trimming a wayward rose branch when she noticed a carriage halt outside her gate. Mr. Rendell stepped out, looking distinctly unsettled. "Miss Marple, may I speak with you privately?" "Of course, Mr. Rendell. Come along inside." Once seated, the solicitor wasted no time. "Something's happened. Something perplexing." Miss Marple poured tea. "Then we shall unperplex it together." Rendell gave a thin smile. "I visited Miss Edgecombe this morning, hoping to clarify a few dates regarding Thomas Hartwell's papers. She's always kept meticulous school records, so I thought she might recall when he last visited the schoolhouse before he traveled abroad." Miss Marple nodded, encouraging him gently. She answered my questions politely, he continued, but as I was leaving, a loose sheet fell from her mantle. I bent to pick it up, assuming it was hers, but she snatched it rather abruptly. I only saw a fragment, just enough to recognize Thomas Hartwell's handwriting. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. A letter? Not exactly. It looked more like a note or memorandum, quite short, but Miss Edgecombe was greatly disturbed by my having seen it. He ran a hand through his hair. Miss Marple, what reason could she possibly have for possessing a private document of Thomas Hartwell's? Many reasons, Miss Marple said mildly. Some innocent, some less so. Did Thomas ever mention her? No, Rendell said firmly. Not once. Miss Marple made a thoughtful sound. Curious indeed. A silence followed, filled only by the soft ticking of the mantel clock. At last, Rendell leaned forward. Miss Marple, do you think this could be connected to Thomas's death? I think, she replied softly, that someone wishes us to believe his death was connected to something unfinished. Whether that is truth or manipulation remains to be seen. After the solicitor left, Miss Marple considered her next steps carefully. If Miss Edgecombe possessed one of Thomas Hartwell's documents, she must have come by it deliberately. And if she was frightened now, it might be because someone knew she had kept it, or because she had given it to the wrong person. Just as Miss Marple was pondering this possibility, a small knock came at her kitchen door. Opening it, she found little Timothy Larch standing there, clutching his cap. Please, Miss Marple, he said, eyes wide with earnest determination. Mum says not to bother you, but I found this on the common, and everyone says you know things. He held out a folded slip of paper. Miss Marple knelt, accepting it with gentle hands. Thank you, Timothy. You were quite right to bring it. The boy rushed off, relieved. Miss Marple unfolded the paper. It was a fragment, a torn corner of a larger page. The handwriting was the stranger's. Next approach, the proud one. Pressure will reveal his fault. Miss Marple drew a slow breath. The proud one. Colonel Denham. She had sensed his growing anxiety. Now she understood its cause. The stranger, or whoever directed him, had shifted focus again, just as the note in the grass had promised. This was no longer merely a campaign of fear. It was a sequence of psychological blows, aimed with precision. Mrs. Prum. Hartwell. Guilt. Miss Edgecombe. Secrets. Colonel Denham. Pride. Each targeted for a different reason, and someone, hidden still, was watching closely for the moment when one of them would break. The next event, Miss Marple realized, was imminent, and it would not be subtle. Miss Marple spent the remainder of the afternoon in quiet contemplation, trimming her roses with slow, deliberate snips that belied the rapid activity of her mind. Someone had moved deliberately from one villager to the next, applying psychological pressure with a surgeon's precision. Now the fragment discovered by Timothy Larch made the intention unmistakable. Colonel Denham was next. And indeed, the colonel had been showing the unmistakable signs of a man under strain, glancing over his shoulder, snapping at harmless remarks, leaving the greengrocer with such haste that he forgot his change. It was not guilt she saw in him, but fear of being exposed. Pride, Miss Marple knew well, often grew from soil enriched by long-buried mistakes. As dusk settled once more over St. Mary Mead, a hush fell across the cottages. Windows glowed softly in the warm light, curtains drawn early out of an unspoken caution. Miss Marple had just settled into her sitting room with her evening tea when raised voices drifted faintly from the lane. She rose immediately. Voices of agitation had their own timbre, and she recognized the colonel's among them, louder than usual, not the bluster of daily irritation, but something raw. Stepping onto her front path, she saw a small gathering forming near the colonel's gate. Mrs. Price was already present, of course, flapping about like a bright, excitable bird, while Mr. Tolland, the churchwarden, looked on with furrowed brows. Colonel Denham himself stood at the centre, red-faced, gripping a crumpled paper in one hand. Miss Marple approached with the quiet, unhurried pace that so often allowed her to enter a scene without provoking defensiveness. Colonel Denham spotted her and stiffened, a flicker of resentment flashing in his eyes. Resentment that she, of all people, had witnessed his moment of discomposure. "I'll thank everyone to mind their own business," he barked, though the strain in his voice betrayed him. "My dear Colonel," Miss Marple said softly, "we're only concerned for your welfare. You seem quite distressed." He hesitated, his jaw working, pride wrestling with relief. At last, he thrust the crumpled paper toward her. "This was pushed under my door. Found it not 10 minutes ago. Utter nonsense, of course, but, well, see for yourself." Miss Marple unfolded the paper gently. The handwriting was unmistakably the same narrow, precise script that had appeared in the notebook and in the scrap found on the common. The message was short. You took what was not yours. Justice delayed is not justice denied. Miss Marple lifted her gaze. "A troubling sentiment." "Utter rot," Denham declared, though his hands trembled with barely suppressed anxiety. "I've taken nothing. Nothing, do you hear?" His eyes darted from face to face, as though expecting contradiction. "The idea that well, it's absurd." Miss Marple privately noted the vehemence. Innocent men protested, yes, but guilty, or frightened, men protested with a desperation that bordered on attack. "Has anything been disturbed in your home?" she asked gently. "No, not that I can see. But the idea of someone creeping up to my door in the dead of night, well, it's intolerable." Mrs. Price murmured comforting platitudes while drinking in every detail with avid delight. Miss Marple turned her attention back to the Colonel. "Did you notice anyone in the lane? Any sound before you discovered the message?" "No," he said shortly, then paused. "Though I did think I heard something earlier. A sort of soft tapping, perhaps. But when I checked the porch, there was no one." Mr. Tolland frowned. "We should call the inspector again." "And have him trudge about finding nothing?" Denham scoffed. "No, thank you. The man is as useful as a wet match." Miss Marple watched him closely. A wet match. An interesting phrase, given the matchbox impression she had found in Mrs. Hartwell's cottage. A careless remark, or something more. The little crowd dispersed eventually, leaving the Colonel muttering and slamming his gate shut. Miss Marple walked home, but not blindly. Instead, she made a small detour, pausing near the tall hedge that ran between the Colonel's garden and Mrs. Fletcher's property. A narrow indentation in the grass caught her eye, a footprint far too slender to be the Colonel's and too deep to be made earlier in the day when the ground was firmer. It pointed away from the Colonel's porch. Someone had waited here, and had listened. Miss Marple returned home with a renewed sense of pattern. Each incident grew bolder, each message more pointed. Fear was increasing in the village like a slow, chill wind. The next morning, she received yet another unexpected visitor. Miss Edgecombe, this time pale but composed, her anxious flutter replaced by a grave determination. "Miss Marple, I must speak with you." She wrung her hands. "I can't keep silent any longer, not after what happened to the Colonel." Miss Marple guided her to the sitting room. "Sit, my dear. You must steady yourself." Miss Edgecombe sat, eyes bright with a mixture of guilt and urgency. "I kept something of Thomas Hartwell's. It came into my hands by accident years ago, before he died. I always meant to return it, but then the accident happened, and I didn't know how to explain." Her voice broke slightly. "And now someone knows." "What exactly did you keep?" Miss Marple asked softly. "A page, sir, just one. I found it tucked behind the drawer of the schoolhouse desk after he'd come in one afternoon to speak with the older pupils about, I don't even remember what now, but the page was addressed to no one. It looked like notes he meant to destroy. She swallowed. It mentioned a name, a person he feared. Miss Marple leaned forward with gentle encouragement. What name, my dear? Miss Edgecombe looked around the room as though the shadows might be listening. Then in a whisper, Charles Denham. Miss Marple felt a subtle tightening in her chest, though her expression did not change. The Colonel, she said softly. Miss Edgecombe nodded. Thomas wrote that Denham had threatened him over something, some dispute neither of them wished public. He said Denham was unstable when cornered. I kept the note because I was frightened, I suppose. And then I simply didn't know what to do. And now someone is using it, Miss Marple said. Yes, Miss Edgecombe whispered. I believe they want the village to think Colonel Denham murdered Thomas. Miss Marple considered the trembling woman. Did Thomas give any explanation for the dispute? No, only that he feared what Denham might do if pressed. Miss Marple sat back quietly. A new layer had been added to the puzzle, dangerous, delicate, impossible to ignore. The stranger's targeted pattern now appeared not merely like psychological testing, but preparation. Someone was laying groundwork. Someone wanted suspicion to bloom in very specific directions. And the page? Miss Marple asked. I burned it this morning, Miss Edgecombe said, wringing her hands. I thought it safest. Miss Marple's heart sank, ever so slightly, for she seldom gave fear full rein. Burning evidence rarely brought safety. My dear, she said gently, you have done what you thought right. But I fear the person who seeks to use that information will not be hindered by the paper's absence. Miss Edgecombe looked up sharply. What do you mean? Miss Marple folded her hands. I mean, my dear, that the truth, or something masquerading as it, has already begun moving through St. Mary Mead, and someone is guiding it with the precision of a man setting dominoes. A knock sounded sharply at the front door. Both women jumped. Miss Marple rose, her expression calm, though her heart beat a touch faster. She opened the door. Colonel Denham stood on the threshold, pale, frantic, and clutching a walking stick as if it were a weapon. Miss Marple, he rasped, I need your help. Something terrible has happened. They've found something in my garden. Miss Marple felt the shift instantly, the subtle quickening of the inevitable. This was the next step, and it had arrived. Colonel Denham stood trembling on Miss Marple's doorstep, his face a blotchy mixture of anger and dread. In all the years she had known him, loud, blustering, prideful, the colonel had never looked frightened. Irritated, yes, indignant, frequently. But fear sat strangely on him, as though it did not quite know where to settle. Something's been found, he repeated, wiping his brow with a shaking hand. In my garden, behind the tool shed. I didn't know who else to go to. Miss Marple fetched her shawl with calm efficiency. Please show me, Colonel. Take your time. Miss Edgecombe, still seated in the sitting room, rose halfway as though to accompany them, but Miss Marple gave her a small nod that gently instructed her to stay. The woman sank back down, trembling anew. Outside, the crisp afternoon sun made the lane seem deceptively peaceful. A few villagers lingered near the colonel's gate, trying to appear as though they were simply enjoying the weather. Among them, Mrs. Price hovered with an air of breathless anticipation, while Mr. Tolland seemed genuinely concerned. When they saw Miss Marple approaching, they parted like a curtain being drawn aside. It's back here, the colonel muttered, leading her past the overgrown hedges into his garden. The tool shed stood crookedly near the far fence, its paint peeling like sunburned skin. The grass behind it was trampled, as though someone had recently paced there in agitation. Perhaps the colonel himself, or perhaps someone else. There, he said hoarsely, pointing to a disturbed patch of soil near the shed's rear wall. Miss Marple lowered herself to examine it. At first glance, it resembled the remnants of a shallow digging, a few inches deep, hastily covered over, the earth darker and looser than its surroundings. Something pale protruded slightly from the soil. She brushed back a thin layer of dirt with careful fingers. A scrap of paper, but this one was not torn like the others. It had been folded with precision, and the sharp crease remained intact even beneath the soil. Miss Marple lifted it delicately and unfolded it. The same unmistakable handwriting stared back at her, each letter thin, severe, decisive. "He feared you. He warned others. Now all shall know." Colonel Denham let out a strangled sound. "It's a lie. A filthy lie." Miss Marple stood slowly, dusting her hands. "Colonel, you must calm yourself." "How am I to calm myself when someone is planting evidence in my own garden? What do they think, that I murdered Thomas Hartwell?" A murmur rippled through the small group that had inevitably followed them into the garden, unable to resist the lure of expanding drama. Mrs. Price's hand flew to her mouth, though her eyes gleamed with terrified excitement. Miss Marple's voice cut through the rising whispers, soft yet unmistakably firm. "Colonel, lower your voice. Rumors thrive on volume." He gulped air, visibly struggling to contain himself. "I had nothing to do with Thomas Hartwell's death. Our disagreement was years ago, absurdly trivial. And he died abroad. For heaven's sake, an accident." "Certainly," Miss Marple said, "and no one here has said otherwise." But the villagers' expressions said plenty. Suspicion, once ignited, moved faster than flame. Inspector Hargreaves, summoned by someone with enthusiastic urgency, arrived moments later. He took the message from Miss Marple, frowning at the neat handwriting, the implication, the deliberate placement. "This is getting out of hand," he muttered. "Notes and whispers and break-ins. It's the work of a lunatic." "Not a lunatic," Miss Marple corrected gently. "A strategist." Hargreaves gave her a look that suggested mild exasperation. "Strategist or fool, he's causing chaos." Miss Marple glanced at the churned soil, the perfect folding of the note. "Oh no, there is nothing foolish in any of this." Hargreaves ordered the area roped off, though Miss Marple doubted it would deter the perpetrator. The colonel remained beside her, sweating profusely, his pride crumbling into raw fear. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, leaning closer, "there is something I must tell you. Something I never bothered to mention because it seemed unimportant, and because I feared it might stir old trouble." She gave him her full attention, though her face remained composed. "When Thomas Hartwell confronted me about that wretched bit of land, well, we exchanged harsh words, foolish tempers on both sides, but afterward he sent me a letter, a conciliatory one." "You never mentioned this to Mr. Rendell," Miss Marple observed. "No," he admitted. "I burned it years ago. It was all done with. No reason to keep it." Miss Marple's eyes softened almost imperceptibly. And yet now the dispute is being revived with great enthusiasm. Hargreaves interrupted then, tugging the colonel aside for questioning, giving Miss Marple a moment alone to observe the scene. She noticed several things at once: Mrs. Price whispering furiously to Mr. Tolland, young Freddie Biggs peering from behind the fence with the gleeful curiosity of youth, and a faint indentation in the soft earth near the shed. A footprint, narrow, deliberate, the same as the one by Mrs. Hartwell's cottage. Someone had orchestrated this moment with extraordinary care, and it was not the colonel. Miss Marple stepped away from the shed and began walking slowly along the side path toward the lane, letting her thoughts unfurl like threads seeking their proper spool. Each clue fit a pattern, not of murder, but of manipulation. Someone was masterfully directing suspicion, first toward Mrs. Hartwell, then Miss Edgecombe, now Colonel Denham. A village of dominoes, each toppled by an invisible hand. Miss Marple had nearly reached the lane when she heard hurried footsteps approaching from behind. She turned to find Mr. Rendell, the solicitor, his face pale. "Miss Marple," he panted, "I've just come from the vicarage. Something new has surfaced." "Something? Yes. Or rather, someone. The stranger. According to the vicar's wife, he returned to the garden earlier today. Quietly. No one noticed him until he placed something on the table and walked away." Miss Marple's pulse quickened. "What did he leave?" Rendell held out a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "This." Miss Marple took it gently. The string was tied with precise, almost meticulous knots. She felt the weight of the contents, thin, light, but rigid. She untied the string, removed the paper. Inside was a photograph of Thomas Hartwell. Standing beside him was another man, face partially turned, but unmistakably identifiable to anyone in St. Mary Mead. Colonel Denham. Miss Marple stared at the photograph, her expression unreadable. Rendell swallowed. "You see what he's doing, don't you? He's trying to suggest—" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "He is suggesting a connection, a secret, a motive. But it's nonsense. The Colonel never traveled abroad." "I know," Miss Marple murmured. "Which is precisely why this photograph is so very interesting." Rendell blinked. "Interesting?" "Yes," she said, folding the picture with delicate care. "Because it is entirely false." She turned then, her step brisker than usual as she headed toward the common. For now, at last, the pattern was unmistakable, and the next move, the one the stranger did not intend, was hers. Miss Marple walked toward the common with deliberate purpose, her footsteps light upon the familiar path. She did not hurry. She seldom did. But there was a new precision in her manner, as though each movement was part of an unfolding pattern she alone could see clearly. The photograph in her pocket felt almost warm against her fingers, not because of its weight, but because of what it represented. A lie presented as truth, a fabrication meticulously crafted. Someone wanted Colonel Denham ruined. Someone wanted Mrs. Hartwell terrified. Someone wanted Miss Edgecombe cornered. But more than that, someone wanted the village to believe a story before the truth had even been told. As she approached the common, Miss Marple noted how quiet it had become. Not from lack of people. There were several villagers gathered near the benches, but from the subdued hum of gossip shifting into something darker. Heads bent close. Voices dropped to hissing whispers. The news of the planted note had spread even more quickly than she anticipated. Mrs. Price caught sight of her immediately, pouncing with the practiced eagerness of a woman who survived on scandal the way others survived on food. "Miss Marple, have you heard? They found something else. Something dreadful. The Colonel's in a state, absolutely undone. And now they say he knew Thomas Hartwell all along." Miss Marple gave her a kindly but firm look. "My dear Mrs. Price, you mustn't let speculation outrun your sense." Mrs. Price flushed but continued unabated. "But the photograph, Miss Marple, the vicar's wife said so. She saw it with her own eyes." "Photographs," Miss Marple said gently, "can be made to show whatever one wishes, particularly in these modern days of clever printing." This notion seemed to short-circuit several of Mrs. Price's assumptions, and she fell momentarily silent. Miss Marple took the opportunity to slip past her and approach Mr. Tolland, who stood nearby with a troubled expression. "Tolland," she said quietly, "did you see the stranger today?" He nodded slowly. "Just for a moment. He passed near the vicarage garden, calm as anything. Set down that parcel, then walked off. No haste, as though he wanted someone to follow, but nobody dared." "And no one did?" Miss Marple asked. "No one," Tolland frowned. "Though I must say, Miss Marple, the man has a peculiar way of turning up exactly where trouble brews." "Yes," she said softly, almost as though he knows where to plant the next seed. Leaving Tolland, she continued toward the far edge of the common, where the elm trees cast long shadows over the grass. A narrow path veered off toward the old quarry road, rarely used now, but still offering privacy for someone who wished to observe without being seen. And there, at the edge of the trees, Miss Marple paused. A cigarette butt lay crushed into the soil, recently extinguished. Not an unusual sight for some, but not at all common in St. Mary Mead, where most men preferred pipes and ladies avoided smoke altogether. The stranger, however, had been seen with cigarettes tucked neatly into his dark coat pocket. Miss Marple leaned down, examining it without touching. Foreign brand. No match for anything the colonel smoked, nor Mr. Rendell, nor the vicar. Someone had stood here, waited here, watched from here. She looked up the slope toward the colonel's garden, partially visible through gaps in the hedgerow, an ideal vantage point. When she returned to the lane, she saw that Mr. Rendell had followed her, maintaining a respectful distance until she acknowledged him with a small nod. "You believe the photograph is false?" he said quietly. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Quite false. The shading around the colonel's face is too sharp, and the alignment of his shoulder does not match the light source. One sees such things more easily when one has spent as many years as I have mending photographs for scrapbooks." Rendell blinked. "Remarkable." "Not at all," she said modestly. "Merely observation." They walked together a short distance before Rendell spoke again, his voice taut with worry. "What is the purpose of all this? Why torment these particular people?" "Because," Miss Marple said gently, "fear makes people reveal truths they would otherwise keep hidden. And guilt, real or imagined, can be coaxed into the open if one applies pressure in the right places." "You think one of them is being forced to confess something?" "No," Miss Marple corrected softly. "I think someone wants it to appear that way." Evening shadows lengthened across the lane as they walked. Dogs barked distantly. A door slammed somewhere. The village was restless, alert, watching itself with anxious eyes. As they neared Miss Marple's cottage, Mr. Rendell stopped, running a hand through his hair. "There is something else," he admitted reluctantly. "Something I hesitated to bring up, but after today's events I feel I must." Miss Marple regarded him steadily. "What is it, Mr. Rendell?" He hesitated, then spoke. "Thomas Hartwell visited me the week before he left England. He was troubled, quite unlike himself. He asked me to draw up a new document, though he never explained its purpose, a private arrangement of sorts." "And did you draw it up?" "Yes. But before I could deliver it, he had already left the country. The document remained in my possession. After his death, I destroyed it. At least I thought I did. It seemed irrelevant by then." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "You thought you were protecting his widow?" "Yes." Rendell exhaled shakily. "But now I wonder, had that document survived somehow? Could someone have found a portion? It might explain why these accusations are being orchestrated." Miss Marple studied him closely. His regret was genuine, his worry sincere, but something about the timing tugged at her thoughts. Someone was driving the village toward a precipice, and now they were reaching for older truths, older fears. "Mr. Rendell," she said kindly, "you may have destroyed your copy, but that does not mean Thomas had none of his own." His expression shifted, startled. I think Thomas Hartwell anticipated more than he ever said aloud," Miss Marple murmured, "and someone else has been waiting for the right moment to use it." As they spoke, footsteps sounded rapidly behind them. Miss Edgecombe came running down the lane, breathless, her face drained of all color. "Miss Marple, oh, thank goodness. Please, come quickly." Miss Marple turned at once. "What has happened?" "It's Mrs. Hartwell," Miss Edgecombe gasped. "She collapsed, in her garden. She's conscious, but she keeps saying she's seen him, the stranger, in her house." Miss Marple felt the quiet shift inside her, the subtle tightening that came when events fell into place. The stranger was escalating, and the next turn, she knew, would be decisive. Without another word, she hurried up the lane toward Mrs. Hartwell's cottage, her pace uncharacteristically swift. For the danger had stopped hiding in shadows. It had stepped directly into a woman's home. Mrs. Hartwell's cottage sat at the edge of the village, its climbing roses and white shutters giving it an air of fragility that seemed amplified now as Miss Marple approached. A small cluster of neighbors hovered outside the gate, speaking in hushed, trembling voices. When they caught sight of her, they parted instinctively, as though making way for the only person who might make sense of what had happened. Miss Marple entered the garden swiftly, but without agitation. Mrs. Hartwell lay propped against the bench near her lilac bush, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her face was pale, her breathing unsteady, but her eyes, wide and frightened, followed Miss Marple the moment she appeared. "He was here," she whispered, "inside the cottage, walking through the parlor as though he belonged there." Miss Marple knelt beside her, taking her trembling hand. "My dear, you're safe now. Tell me slowly what you saw." Mrs. Hartwell swallowed, gathering shaky breath. "I heard the door creak. The wind does that sometimes, so I thought nothing of it. But then I heard footsteps. Soft but certain. I went to the parlor doorway and—" Her voice faltered. "He was there, his back to me, looking at Thomas's photograph on the mantel." A murmur rippled through the onlooking villagers. Miss Marple's grip tightened gently. "Did he speak?" she asked. Mrs. Hartwell nodded faintly. "He said, 'You kept what he hid. You will have to face it now.' And then he turned. His eyes— oh, Miss Marple, his eyes were cold, so cold, and in the next moment he was gone. I blinked, and he was already at the door, moving so quickly I could hardly believe it. I must have fainted." Miss Marple soothed her with calm murmurs, while her mind raced. The stranger had escalated from whispers and messages to an open confrontation, but Miss Marple could not picture him as a man who fled abruptly. His movements, as described before, were deliberate, measured. A man so controlled would not run, unless he had reason to fear being seen, or unless he wanted Mrs. Hartwell to think he vanished like a spectre. Inspector Hargreaves arrived shortly after, full of questions and bluster that only served to frighten Mrs. Hartwell further. Miss Marple intervened gently, urging him to keep his inquiries brief. Once satisfied that Mrs. Hartwell was in no immediate danger, the inspector ordered a search of the cottage. Miss Marple watched this with quiet interest. Nothing had been taken. Nothing had been disturbed, except, curiously, the drawer of the sideboard where Mrs. Hartwell kept old correspondence. It was slightly ajar, though not enough for Mrs. Hartwell to have noticed earlier. Miss Marple took careful note of it. When the inspector finally dismissed the gathering and left 2 constables to patrol the area, Miss Marple remained behind. She walked through the cottage in soft, measured steps, making no more sound than a falling petal. Miss Edgecombe joined her in the doorway, pale and shaken. "I thought she was dying when I found her," she whispered. "She was lying on the ground, gasping. I've never seen her like that." "You were passing at the time?" "Yes. I had been walking to the post office and saw her gate open. I knew she always closed it, even for a moment. And then I saw her collapse." Her eyes brimmed. "This is all becoming too much. Who is doing this to us?" "That," Miss Marple said gently, "is what I intend to discover." She moved toward the sideboard and opened the drawer fully. Rows of neatly tied letters lay inside, precisely arranged. Yet one bundle was slightly misaligned, shifted by a few inches. Its string loosened. Miss Marple lifted it carefully. The top envelope bore a faint smudge, as though handled recently by fingers not entirely clean. She scanned the dates. These were older letters, written early in the Hartwells' marriage. Harmless domestic notes, affectionate exchanges, nothing remarkable. But beneath them lay a single yellowed envelope, its flap torn long ago. Miss Marple slid it out. Empty. "Did Mrs. Hartwell show you this?" she asked Miss Edgecombe. "No," she whispered. "I've never seen it." Miss Marple nodded. Someone had searched for a specific piece of correspondence and either found it or confirmed its absence. She returned the letters neatly and closed the drawer. Her eyes moved to the floor. A faint trail of dust marked a single set of footprints, not heavy enough for a man of Colonel Denham's weight, nor shaped like Mr. Rendell's sensible leather shoes. These prints were narrow, precise. The stranger's. Miss Marple followed the trail to the threshold, then beyond it, where the prints vanished into the path leading toward the vicarage. A deliberate choice, almost symbolic. Outside, Mrs. Hartwell had regained enough strength to speak again. "Miss Marple," she said faintly, "why is this happening? Why now?" Miss Marple knelt beside her once more. "Because someone wishes to stir a memory that has slept too long, and because you and 2 others hold pieces of a truth none of you yet fully perceive." Mrs. Hartwell shook her head in bewilderment. "But I don't know anything." Miss Marple touched her hand gently. "Not consciously, perhaps, but your husband did, and someone believes he left something behind, something they very much want." Mrs. Hartwell's face crumpled. "The stranger, he said Thomas knew the truth. But Thomas had no enemies." Miss Marple's voice remained soft. "My dear, men do not always speak of their enemies, especially not to protect the ones they love." That thought seemed to strike Mrs. Hartwell deeply, and she leaned back, eyes closed. Miss Edgecombe approached. "Will she be all right?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Rest will help her, but the strain will worsen before it eases." Miss Edgecombe shivered. "Do you think he'll come back?" Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the path where the footprints had vanished. "Oh yes, he will return." She felt Miss Edgecombe stiffen beside her. Fear made the schoolmistress's breathing shallow. "Then what are we to do?" she whispered. "We are to think," Miss Marple said quietly, carefully, calmly, and without giving in to fright. As evening crept nearer, Miss Marple walked slowly home. The sky glowed violet, the air tinged with coolness. She let the rhythm of her steps settle her thoughts. The stranger had entered a home. He had stared at a photograph. He had spoken words meant not to terrify blindly, but to provoke a specific fear, that of hidden truth, of someone long dead leaving unfinished business. These were not the actions of a murderer. They were the actions of someone preparing the stage. At her gate, she paused. On her doorstep lay a small card, plain, unmarked except for a single line in the same narrow handwriting. "You're looking in the wrong place." Miss Marple read it calmly. Then she smiled, a small, almost sorrowful smile, because she knew with perfect certainty that she was very close to the right one. Miss Marple slipped the card into her pocket and let her hand rest there for a moment, feeling the faint impression of the handwriting through the paper. "You are looking in the wrong place." A warning or a taunt, but more importantly, an admission. Someone had been close enough to observe her movements, confident enough to anticipate her next steps, and bold enough to risk approaching her doorstep despite constables patrolling nearby. It told her, quite clearly, that the game was nearing its climax. Inside her cottage, she lit a small lamp and settled before her writing desk. Darkness deepened outside, pressing gently against the window panes, but Miss Marple did not draw the curtains. Instead, she gazed out at the faintly illuminated lane, as though the night itself might offer her an answer. Pieces were falling into place. She reviewed them quietly. Mrs. Hartwell, pressured through guilt and memory. Miss Edgecombe, pressured through secrets long held. Colonel Denham, pressured through pride and fear of disgrace. Each pressured personally, psychologically, and each placed in conflict with the memory of Thomas Hartwell. But the stranger's behavior, for all its menace, lacked one crucial quality: personal investment. He played the part given to him, that much was now clear. Someone else, someone within the village, had set these events in motion. A faint knock interrupted her thoughts, tentative, barely audible. Miss Marple rose at once. Few people knocked so softly, especially in times of distress. When she opened the door, her suspicion was confirmed. Miss Edgecombe stood there, clutching her coat around her, as though shielding herself from more than the evening chill. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't know where else to go." Miss Marple stepped aside. "Come in, my dear." Miss Edgecombe entered with the hesitance of someone fearing even to cast a shadow. She perched on the edge of the settee, hands gripping each other tightly. "I've been thinking," she began, and Miss Marple could tell at once that it had taken courage for her to come. "About that note of Thomas's, the one I told you about. I burned the page, but I remember something else. A word I didn't mention earlier because I didn't think it mattered." Miss Marple listened, patient, calm. "There was a name," Miss Edgecombe said. "Not Denham's. Another, written faintly in the margin, as though Thomas added it later. I didn't pay it much attention then. It meant nothing to me." Miss Marple leaned slightly forward. "What was the name?" "Rendell." Silence settled in the room like dust. Miss Marple's expression remained serene, but inwardly a quiet click sounded, the final piece sliding into its place. "I see," she said gently. Miss Edgecombe looked up sharply, alarmed by Miss Marple's lack of surprise. "You knew?" "I suspected," Miss Marple replied. "But suspicion is not proof. Your memory is invaluable, my dear." Miss Edgecombe exhaled shakily, relief and dread mingling in her eyes. "Do you think could he be the one behind all this?" Miss Marple rose, walking slowly to the hearth. "I think Mr. Rendell has walked a very narrow path between conscience and desperation for quite some time. I also think Thomas Hartwell entrusted him with something he did not want known, and that Thomas's death, though accidental, left loose ends Mr. Rendell hoped would remain buried." Miss Edgecombe pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. "But Mr. Rendell is so gentle, so reliable." "Reliability," Miss Marple murmured, "is sometimes the cloak worn by those who fear discovery most." "But the stranger, a useful instrument," Miss Marple said, "an outsider hired or persuaded to plant suggestions, deliver false evidence, unsettle the villagers. Someone discreet enough to vanish, but obedient enough to follow directions." A soft gasp escaped Miss Edgecombe. "And the photograph?" "Fabricated," Miss Marple said. "A solicitor, privy to personal documents, knows better than most how to arrange a convincing falsehood. Mr. Rendell may not have created the photograph himself, but he would know whom to engage." Miss Edgecombe shook her head slowly. "But why torment Mrs. Hartwell? She has done nothing." "On the contrary," Miss Marple said softly, "she possesses, or once possessed, something Thomas Hartwell meant to keep safe. Perhaps the original of that document Mr. Rendell claimed to have destroyed?" Miss Edgecombe's eyes widened as the pieces realigned in her mind. "He's been searching for it." "Yes," Miss Marple said, and frightening her was intended to shake loose whatever scrap of truth she might unknowingly hold. A knock at the door interrupted them, loud, hurried. Miss Edgecombe startled violently. Miss Marple placed a reassuring hand on her arm before opening the door. Mr. Rendell stood on the step, raincoat unbuttoned, face strained but composed. "Miss Marple," he said breathlessly, "I came at once. The stranger has been seen again, near the quarry road. I thought you should know." "How kind," Miss Marple said, her tone deceptively mild. "Won't you come in?" He hesitated only a moment before stepping inside, long enough for Miss Marple to know he was calculating. When he saw Miss Edgecombe, he feigned surprise, well, too well. "Miss Edgecombe, are you all right? I heard there was trouble at Mrs. Hartwell's." "Yes," Miss Edgecombe cut in, her voice steadying. "And I've remembered something important, something about Thomas Hartwell." Miss Marple watched the solicitor's reaction. He froze, not visibly, not dramatically, but a flicker crossed his eyes, a tightening around the jaw. "What sort of something?" he asked lightly. Miss Marple answered for her. "Something he wrote, in the margin of a page." Rendell's composure cracked. "You told her about that?" He snapped at Miss Edgecombe before he could stop himself. The room fell still. Miss Edgecombe paled. Miss Marple's expression did not change. "So," Miss Marple said gently, "you did know about the marginal note." Rendell swallowed. Yes, Thomas mentioned it once. Meaningless, really." "No doubt," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly. "Just as meaningless as the document you claim to have destroyed and yet have been searching for ever since Thomas's death." Rendell's hand twitched toward his coat pocket. Miss Marple's voice grew firmer. "Please don't, Mr. Rendell. Whatever you believe you can do now, the constables are watching the lane. And Miss Edgecombe has told me everything." Rendell's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him in a single exhale. "You don't understand," he whispered. "If that document surfaces, my life is ruined." "What was it?" Miss Marple asked softly. He closed his eyes. "A confession. Not mine. Thomas's. He feared exposure for something he'd uncovered in my records years ago. I begged him to keep silent, and he agreed. But then he wrote that wretched page. Insurance, he called it. Insurance against my weakness. And after his death," Miss Marple said, "you feared the insurance survived." "Yes," he whispered. "I tried to find it quietly. I hired a man, a discreet man, to make inquiries. I never meant for it to go this far." Miss Edgecombe stared at him in horror. "You never meant to terrify us? To break into a woman's home?" Rendell shook his head. "I only asked him to recover the paper if it existed. He embellished the methods." Miss Marple regarded him sadly. "Desperation, Mr. Rendell, often leads people into alliances they do not fully control." At that moment, a sharp whistle pierced the air outside, a constable's signal. Footsteps pounded down the lane. Miss Marple sighed softly. "I believe," she said, "the stranger has been found." Rendell closed his eyes in defeat, and the truth at last stepped fully into the light. Miss Marple watched the rain begin to fall softly outside the cottage window, the steady rhythm of drops against the panes offering a quiet counterpoint to the turmoil that had overtaken St. Mary Mead over the past days. Inside, the room held a tension that had been mounting almost imperceptibly, like a cord stretched too tightly, ready to snap. Now, at last, the threads of deceit and fear were ready to be pulled into the open. Rendell sat in the chair opposite her, head lowered, hands clasped tightly together. Miss Edgecombe stood near the window, pale but relieved, as though simply being in the light of understanding was enough to soothe the shock. Mrs. Hartwell's small form rested on the settee, covered by a blanket, eyes wide but attentive. All were waiting, though none quite knew what would emerge. None, that is, except Miss Marple. "Mr. Rendell," she began softly, "we have come to the point where there is no longer any need for shadows." She laid the torn scraps, the notes, and the photograph carefully on the table before her. "Everything that has occurred, the whispers, the planted documents, the threats, has a single origin. And that origin is you." Rendell's gaze flickered to the evidence, then back to her, his composure faltering. I never meant for anyone to be harmed," he murmured. I only wanted the document, the one Thomas left behind. I thought it would be safest to recover it quietly. I never imagined that your methods would frighten the innocent," Miss Marple prompted gently. "No, of course you did not. But you see, Mr. Rendell, your understanding of human nature is not as precise as you believed. Fear does not remain contained. It spreads. You enlisted a stranger to unsettle the village, and in doing so, you lost control of the consequences." Rendell's hands trembled. "It was only meant to secure the insurance," Thomas wrote. "I did not touch the original, I swear." Miss Marple's eyes held his steadily. "Indeed. But you needed to test those who held knowledge of it. Mrs. Hartwell, because she possessed his letters. Miss Edgecombe, because she knew a fragment of the truth. Colonel Denham, because his pride and his past disputes with Thomas made him susceptible to suspicion. You manipulated them with calculated precision, and you misjudged their resilience." Rendell lowered his gaze completely. "I see now. Yes, I see. It became more than I intended. But the stranger, he was careful, silent. I only gave him instructions." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Instructions, but you underestimated how predictable human behavior can be under stress. And predictability is precisely how I observed, noted, and understood each move before it escalated." Mrs. Hartwell leaned forward, voice barely a whisper. "So, he wasn't here to harm me?" "No, my dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "He was a tool. The true hand behind it is not a stranger at all, but one intimately familiar with the village, with its people, and with its secrets. You, Mr. Rendell." Rendell buried his face in his hands. I did not intend for anyone to think I—" "You need not explain further," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "All is now revealed. The police have been informed, and the stranger has been traced. Your complicity in these events, though motivated by a desire to control a piece of Thomas's past, has come to light before it could spiral further." Miss Edgecombe exhaled, relief evident in the release of her taut shoulders. I thought I was seeing things, that I might be imagining the danger," she whispered. "You are not imagining," Miss Marple said. "You were observing the truth through a very clever misdirection, but you, like the others, have been guided by fear rather than malice." Rendell raised his head slightly, eyes glistening. "And the document, the one Thomas left?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It is secure. Mrs. Hartwell's letters remain safe, and Thomas's intentions, preserved in part, have been honored. You see, Mr. Rendell, in all the turmoil, no true harm was done to that which mattered most. Only your methods, and your fear of exposure, caused confusion." The solicitor's shoulders slumped in acknowledgement, a mixture of shame and relief on his face. Outside, the rain had slowed to a gentle drizzle, casting a silvery light across the garden, and inside, a calm settled where tension had once ruled. Miss Marple turned to the two women. "Now, my dears, it is time to let the village return to its ordinary rhythm. Life will resume, and people will remember the events, but they will recall them as tales of fear quickly dissipated. Lessons, perhaps, and relief." Mrs. Hartwell's eyes shone with gratitude. "Thank you, Miss Marple. Without you, without your understanding, I don't know what might have happened." Miss Marple smiled, her knitting resting on her lap. "I merely observed. Human nature, in its infinite variety, provides enough drama on its own." Miss Edgecombe reached for her hand. "You saw it all clearly, didn't you?" Miss Marple nodded. "I only noticed what others do not, or prefer not to see. Truth is seldom hidden. It is merely overlooked. And in the quiet moments, it speaks." The rain outside ceased entirely, leaving the village washed clean, the evening calm. The fear, the manipulation, and the threats had been confronted and understood. Miss Marple's gentle, relentless insight had untangled a web of lies, half-truths, and misdirection, She settled back in her chair, the room finally quiet, and reflected on the delicate balance of human hearts. Some hearts, she thought, are easily unsettled. Some are tempted by secrecy, and some, like hers, must patiently watch, quietly unraveling the mysteries that others cannot see. The village would awaken tomorrow, untouched by the subtle forces that had threatened to unseat it, its secrets now acknowledged, its truths finally restored. And in that quiet reflection, Miss Marple, ever composed, smiled at the enduring complexity and resilience of human nature. Sir,